All right, good afternoon. Checking in here, picking up where we left off in class today. We were talking about the American Revolution, and really also we're talking about the French Revolution, although we haven't gotten into that just yet. Um, and we'll be talking about how this gives rise to new ideas surrounding freedom. And I discussed this a little bit in class already today. See if I can get my clicker here to cooperate. If not, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. And we discussed sort of the early experience and some of the developments and concepts that guided this early experiment in what we might call the principles of the European Enlightenment finding concrete expression on the ground in places like the British colonies along the North Atlantic, and then eventually in the French Revolution. And we discussed these, so I won't spend too much more time here. You can shore up your notes if you like to. We left off today talking about some of the early developments of the American Revolution, and in some ways this was a exercise in high-minded principles and concerns about faulty precedents being set. We discussed the period of salutary neglect and how the English colonists had grown accustomed and more or less comfortable with making their own decisions, and in many respects this had given them an early experience in popular sovereignty and this notion that the people who inhabit a land ought to first and foremost be the people whose judgments and policies are in fact responsible for governing and running that land. And of course that's not exactly what a colonial mother country wishes to hear. The colonial period and the mercantilist period of Europe would be highly incompatible with that line of thinking. Nonetheless, it's the kind of thinking that took shape and took root in the English colonies, and now they're the British colonies. And so the fundamental challenge that Great Britain faces as the American Declaration and the American Revolution come closer and closer into focus is, how do we pay for the expenses attached to running our colonial system without also tapping into the revenues that the colonies are generating? And looked at from that perspective, it seems surprisingly reasonable. But the challenge, the other side of that challenge was, from the British perspective, is how do you do this? How do you create revenue from a colonial enterprise, but ideally create that revenue while not relinquishing or while not handing over any authority by which that colony is ruled? And so that's sort of that's essentially the crux move that Great Britain never quite figures out. And the colonists themselves do a great job of pushing back as the British Crown is increasingly trying to establish its hold, or I should say reestablish its hold, after well over a century of largely neglectful policies pertaining to the colonies. So this is really a difficult situation, and I think it's fair to say that the British Crown never figures this out, and with each failure, they push their British colonies along the North Atlantic further and further toward revolution. But it starts simply enough in an effort to recoup revenues following the successful French and Indian War. And they start with things like the Townshend duties, the Stamp Act. These are efforts by the crown to create revenues. Of course, each time they do this, they are resisted in the colonies. And it's worth noting that the role of Massachusetts here is important because the colonists of Massachusetts were more comfortable pushing back and voicing their concerns and even risking retribution from the crown. And so Massachusetts is not the only power base of the colonies, but it is a critical one. And of course, out of these efforts by the Brits to tax their colonies comes this cry which adds sort of definition to this notion of, you can't tax us if you don't allow us to have a seat at the table whereby those taxes are being determined. And so taxes and representation really neatly captures both sides of that early dilemma that the British faced. It was part money and it was also part power, and taxes and representation, that phrase captures both of those elements quite well. So the Declaration of Independence comes, and we spoke about that a little bit in class, and that it was a carefully structured statement that had some principles and elements of the Enlightenment sewn within it. It wasn't just a hunch, and it wasn't a document that simply played to one's passions and frustrations. It spoke to specific, identifiable, empirical, objective, rational occurrences that the colonists were finding problems with. And also, I think it's worth noting there's also some philosophy in this document, right? We have a sense of Locke's comments about the natural rights that all individuals have, and how these natural rights are at the heart of the many specific problems that the Crown is creating by denying the colonists their specific freedoms and their specific role of authority in running their own affairs. So the Declaration turns a early sort of resistance movement into a full-on independence movement, and that's a big shift. So along comes the war, and we know that things started off, in 1775, Lexington and Concord. The Brits were a little baffled by what is it that we're dealing with here. These ragtag guerrilla armies doesn't fight quite like we're used to. They're not conventional soldiers. They're not marching in neat, orderly, predictable lines. What do? Well, we start to figure that out, and of course Britain has some real naval advantages and some infantry advantages, and this sort of settles into some early difficult times. And one of the most pressing times, of course, is the winter of 1776 and 1777, when Washington and his men are almost pushed to the breaking point in Trenton, New Jersey. And it's worth noting that part of the challenge that the Continental Army faces is that there's not clear willingness and there's not a strong revolutionary government to provide the resources and approve the resources that this new army would need. It's fair to say that for the colonials, they just didn't have much of a sense of what it would take to run their own independent state. And so they're caught a little unawares, and unfortunately for George Washington, he's witnessing some of his men who are coming up at the end of their enlistment at the end of the year 1776. It's not just a cold and miserable winter, but it's also a winter that's witnessing the really the end of the early militia that constitutes the Continental Army. Fortunately, those things are eventually worked out, and the narrow survival of Washington and his men combined with some resources that are approved to add a little bit of extra strength and stability to the military, allows them to live to see another day. And in October of '77, in the Battle of Saratoga, this is a really important moment in the revolution, because it's in the Battle of Saratoga where the young U.S. Army witnesses a critical and strategic victory. And the reason that Saratoga is so important is it's largely used as the premise whereby Benjamin Franklin is able to talk the French into entering into the American Revolution. And so in short order, both the French and the Spanish, always eager to help bring about the demise of their rival power, Great Britain, they enter into the conflict, and this foreign support proves absolutely critical. And by 1781, with the foreign assistance, the Continental Army will prevail in the Battle of Yorktown, which is really the end. I mean, the Revolutionary War is not yet over, but it effectively is. It's a matter of several months before the Treaty of Paris will be signed, but the Battle of Yorktown is really kind of the writing on the wall for the Brits. And so that becomes a critical element of this revolution. And then just quickly, with the little time that we have left, the challenges are still there for this now young nation. We talked about how the Declaration didn't really give any clear the Declaration was just an aspirational document. It was an effort to explain why it was that the colonies were now staking out their independence. But none of that meant anything until after they successfully prevailed in the Revolution. And if you were a betting person in 1776, you would have been kind of crazy to put your money on these young colonists turned U.S. because they just didn't have the resources that the Brits had. Anyway, the Articles of Confederation had proven to be difficult. In 1781, we know that these colonist turned states were reluctant to give power to a powerful government because, of course, that was an institution, and the early the leaders of the European Enlightenment, they were not eager to build up powerful institutions because the Enlightenment, of course, was, if nothing else, a rising up and a challenging of powerful institutions. So they realized that they needed, despite this misgiving and mistrust, this distrust of powerful institutions, they knew that in order to be a powerful nation, they needed a stronger and more reasonably organized system of government. And so the Constitutional Convention was called well, I should say the Ratification Convention. The convention had been called earlier because by 1787 we have the first completed draft, and the Constitution is actually ratified. I'm sorry, it's passed, but it won't actually be solidified until a Bill of Rights can be added to help relieve some of the concerns that many of these new states had about protecting individual freedoms. And so the Bill of Rights is a huge part. This is a list of protections for individuals, and then of course that also serves to help the states. Of course, the one thing, the major issue that the new Constitution won't resolve is slavery, and that will be postponed until the mid-19th century when the Civil War, after a series of quote-unquote compromises, forestall the issue of slavery. But the final point I want to make here is that it's worth noting that the U.S. Constitution is a Republican document. And as a Republican document, it means really that it's a conservative revolution. And by that I mean it elevates many of the wealthier and more powerful, educated members of society to make decisions on behalf of many of the other people around it.